Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Emma Morton, and I'd like to warmly welcome you to our 8th Talk.BD event, which I'm very pleased to be hosting today on behalf of Crest.BD. This is a series of online gatherings that we started as a way to provide some extra support and practical coping tips during the COVID-19 pandemic. And surprisingly now, we've been having these sessions every few weeks or so for the past 3 months. And we've covered topics like managing anxiety and depression, ways to sleep better, managing substance use, and family cohesion during social distancing. And you can watch all of the recordings of these events on our Talk.BD live page. We've been really pleased with the feedback that we've been getting about this series of events, and it's clear that doing these kind of online gatherings is a really useful way for people to hear about some of the recent research that we've been doing, both in the Crest.BD team and more broadly, and to share tips about ways to improve quality of life for people with bipolar disorder. So we've been thinking about whether we can cover some topics not necessarily related to the global pandemic, particularly as some places in the world start to relax some of those physical distancing restrictions. So we had some post-webinar surveys and we got some interest in the topic of both from people who live with bipolar disorder and people who support someone in their life with bipolar disorder about how you can age well when living with the condition. And we think that this is a really important topic to cover, particularly as our assumptions about aging may not be correct. People sometimes expect that growing older will be associated with poorer quality of life because physical health changes, people's ability to work and socialize changes. But there's actually findings that show that quality of life can improve as people get older. And in fact, there was a study released just today from UBC, which showed that older adults have actually been more emotionally resilient, experienced greater emotional well-being, and felt less stressed and threatened by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the research has suggested that that may be due to coping skills that older adults develop over their lives. So we'll have a look at some bipolar disorder specific aspects of aging, including challenges that people might face, but also, and this is something that we always think is important to focus on at Crest.BD, the strengths that people might develop and how to capitalize on that. So we have guest speakers today joining us, Dr. Lizzie Tyler from Lancaster University from our partner organisation Spectrum, who's going to tell us some more about recent research about ageing and bipolar disorder and some of the evidence-supported wellness strategies that her team developed. And we have the always wonderful Victoria Maxwell joining us. So we'll do some quick introductions and then I'll quickly run through some housekeeping notes before I hand over the mic to Victoria and Lizzie. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm joining you from, actually for once, sunny Vancouver. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of British Columbia, and I've been physically with the Crest.BD team for almost a year now, but I've been working with them in some capacity since 2015. And my research focuses on ways to optimize quality of life, particularly for people with bipolar disorder. And in the past, I've also worked as a psychologist as well. I didn't really think of myself as an outdoorsy person, but now that it is actually kind of real summer in Vancouver, I've been getting out, or more accurately, being dragged out of the house by some friends. I'm learning roller skating and I'm starting to do some of the hiking and really taking advantage of this beautiful weather. And I'll pass the mic now to Lizzie to introduce herself.
Okay, so everybody, I'm Lizzie Tyler. I work at the Spectrum Centre, so I know that you've already had a couple of people, Fiona and Steve, come to talk to you from the Spectrum Centre already. So we're based at Lancaster University, which is in the northwest of England, and I've worked there for about nearly 10 years now. My background is as a psychologist. But at the university, I'm a lecturer and I'm working as a research fellow So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the work that I've done today. I actually live in Manchester, which is about 50 miles from Lancaster, and that's where I am today. And I have 2 little boys who keep me very busy. And when I get 5 minutes, well, I hope an hour to myself, I like to shut the door and do a bit of yoga. That's what I really enjoy doing.
I'm Victoria Maxwell, and those of you who have watched this before know a little bit about my background. I live with bipolar disorder and anxiety and psychosis, and I'm a mental health speaker. I do presentations and really theatrical keynotes about my own experience, and I use a lot of humor doing that. And I do mental health coaching, and I do creativity workshops as well. One of the things, and I've been with Crest, I guess, since its inception, and I've been a peer researcher, and it's been a really great experience doing that as well. And then talking a little bit about some of the stuff I do personally. I was thinking about this, and some of them, surprisingly, I love crosswords, and I'm not very good at them at all. And I realize there's tricks, so I'm learning some of the tricks with them. Just recently, there are 3 barred owls in our yard during the day. And so there's a mama one and 2 little ones. One was completely goofy and was not acting like an owl, like did not know that anyway, it was quite funny. Yeah, and so that's been a real special thing. And I think that's one thing that's lovely when you're living on the Sunshine Coast where I am. So, yeah.
Thank you both. It's really great to have you here with us today. Just a quick couple of housekeeping points. We have people who are joining us via Zoom today, and we also are live streaming this via Facebook. So we're taking questions in a number of ways. People have already submitted some questions before the presentation via the Crest.BD website. You can also enter your questions in the Zoom Q&A panel, or you can post comments on Facebook on our Crest.BD page. And after the main presentation, we'll try to answer as many as we can. With that, I will pass over the mic to Lizzie.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start off just talking a little bit about later life bipolar disorder. And I guess I was thinking about some of the questions that people might want to ask about aging with bipolar. And how bipolar progresses, really. So will my symptoms get worse? Will my symptoms get better? Will I need different ways to manage it? Will I need different sources of support? And those are all things that are really valid questions that people have. So hopefully I can share with you what I know from the literature, and also from some of the work that we're doing at Spectrum. But I guess it's really important to emphasise that the literature base is quite limited when it comes to older people. So there hasn't been as much research or as much service development for older people with bipolar. And that's really one of the reasons why I've been so interested in doing this work. If we look at the broader literature, so if we look at older people with a range of other mental health conditions, we can see that that people's needs do seem to change as they get a little bit older. So we can look at things like people's jobs. So perhaps people stop working and there's a change of role there. People might have changes of role in their family or with their sort of social support, and they might have changes in their relationships as well. They also, we know that people have more physical comorbidities. So I think there's a recent study that's found that people who live with bipolar in older age have around 3 to 4 additional physical health comorbidities to live with. And there also might be some cognitive changes as well that come with later life. So all of those things might impact to affect the sort of support that people need in later life. But one of the things that we do know for definite from the older adult literature for bipolar specifically is that at the moment, older people aren't given access to any evidence-based treatments. So what that means is that there aren't any published studies which have evaluated psychological therapies for older people with bipolar specifically. So that's why have begun to do the work that I'm doing at the Spectrum Centre, and we have developed a psychological therapy for older people, and we have run a study based on that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that a bit later on, but that's really just a bit of a background to why we're doing the things that we're doing at Spectrum. So when we look at later life bipolar disorder, we know now that people continue to present with symptoms and have relapses throughout the age range, throughout the lifespan. So when we're talking about older people, that's people over the age of 60. So that's how the literature defines older age. And we know studies have found that the prevalence rates, so that's the number of people living with the condition for older people, are around 0.5 to 1% for that group. And we also know that that group of people are a heterogeneous group, so they're made up of different types. So we have people that have early onset bipolar disorder. So that's people that will have their first manic episode before the age of 50. And then we have people that have their first manic episode after the age of 50. And we split that up in the literature to call people early onset and late onset bipolar disorder. And there do seem to be a few differences there. But like I said, we know that it continues to present throughout the lifespan now, and there were some older theories that suggested that bipolar burnt out, and that was because the prevalence rates were quite a lot lower than they were for a younger sample. But we know now that people will continue to present throughout. So we know that also that bipolar in later life can be a challenge for people, and it can be a challenge for family members and for healthcare services as well. So there's a recent study as well that's found that people with bipolar in later life are 4 times more likely to be hospitalised than people with unipolar depression. So when we look at what the clinical presentation looks like in later life, again, there's quite limited literature, but there is some evidence to suggest that there's less psychotic features as people get older. So those are some of the more unusual experiences that people might have when they're high or low. So that might be the visual or auditory hallucinations or delusions. So there is some evidence to suggest that they decrease. There's some evidence to suggest that depression and depressive episodes might increase. And actually, when I was developing the therapy, I ran some focus groups with people, with older adults with bipolar disorder. And that was one of the things that they shared with me as well. So they talked a little bit about their experience of having later life bipolar. And they said that both their episodes of mania and depression felt different now they were older. In general, people said that they were experiencing more lows. And some people said that their episodes were shorter and milder, and some people were saying that they were having less episodes. And when it came to manic episodes, one person in particular said and shared with us that their experience of mania felt more cognitive now rather than physical. So, for example, they were having more of the racing thoughts, and rather than actually doing some of the behavioural changes that can come with mania, like when people are younger, they might have been more socially active or partying or working more, that kind of increased drive that they found. So those were just some reflections that people shared with me, which seemed to mirror some of the things that you can find in the literature. But this is something that I'd be interested to hear
Sorry,
from.
Liz, can I just, I'll
Yeah.
just interject. Yeah, I thought it might be a good time to sort of reflect on my experience and then my mom's. And so my mom is 89 and she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And I was diagnosed, I'd be considered early onset. I'm not 60, I'm 53, but I definitely feel like I'm aging with bipolar disorder. And I wish in some ways that the older adult included sort of 55 or 50. But it's interesting hearing what you just said, because I can echo some of it, is that from my personal experience, my manias have decreased and I would say are almost non-existent. There might be a little bit of hypomania, but like a day or so. But the depressions definitely for me have, they're more. And I've noticed recently that they're actually more severe than they have been in the past, but I think that has something to do with some other environmental influences. And psychosis, I surprisingly had a couple of psychoses. More recently, I had a real long time when I wasn't having any. But the interesting thing was, and I guess this comes with aging with bipolar disorder, is that my coping tools with psychosis allowed it to not escalate. So I wasn't hospitalized. I was able to manage it. I had a lot of insight into it. So that was very different from previously when I had psychosis. And then with my mom, it's been very different. Her bipolar disorder, like you said, her episodes have lessened. Mania has, it's not occurring. She'd never had psychosis. And the depressions definitely are not particularly there. She has anxiety more. So it's interesting where it looks like she's having less episodes and it's not impacting her life like it did. So I think that definitely means that there needs to be more research to find out what generally people's experiences are. But yeah, it was good to hear. So thanks.
Yeah, and those were some of the things that I was interested in having your thoughts on, really, because if you look at the literature, the wider literature, and there have been studies that have found that rates of anxiety and depression are lower in younger people than they are in older people. So actually, there's quite a prominent older adult researcher in the UK called Ken Laidlaw, and one of his papers, he talks about how depression isn't an automatic response to aging, and therefore it's something that I've thought about a lot throughout this study. Is that why is it that people with the older people with bipolar are tending to present more with the depression and the lows than the highs for us, but also you know, compared to the wider population.
Yeah, and just to note, in both my mom's and ours, anxiety has increased a lot too. So yeah, I think that's very interesting what you're talking about. Yeah.
So some of the reflections from people in the focus groups and some of the interesting ideas that came out about that seemed to link with why they were feeling lower at times, is it was definitely the people that had more time on their hands, that had less social support, that had less of a role, those that had a voluntary job or had quite a tight-knit family setting were definitely, it felt like they felt they were coping better, and they definitely were more confident and felt and weren't experiencing quite as many of the dips, and also there was also this a theme around sort of the level of stigma that people had experienced over the lifespan. And it was quite interesting in this group of people, because people are experiencing almost a double pronged kind of stigma at this point, because they have the stigma can come with living with a mental health condition, but also the stigma that can come with age as well, and those ageist assumptions that come. And those are some of the reasons why perhaps we haven't seen the development, the service development, is that, you know, there are those ageist assumptions that are people too old to change, or, you know, when people, and why, you know,
why bother?
Yeah,
We're getting older anyway. Yeah,
and that,
no, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's definitely, you know, definitely not an assumption that I hold. But these are the sort of stereotypes that people have been subjected to, and these were some of the feelings that were coming out through these groups, that they were having these kind of double kind of stigma experiences. So, and it was in there, you know, some interesting reflections came through that. When it came to coping with bipolar in later life, all of the people in the focus groups and all of the people that have taken part in the research trial were on medication. All bar one person in the research trial wasn't on medication. And the people in the focus groups, they were worried about the impact of medication on their memory. So that was something that was quite a concern to them. And I think that'll echo other people's concerns about memory difficulties. And I mean, memory difficulties is something that people will report across the lifespan when it comes to working with people with bipolar. So it's not something that's unique to an older adult group, but it's definitely something that came up as a concern. There was a feeling that people had learned to manage their bipolar more effectively over the years. So they'd learned their triggers, and they'd learned their coping skills, and what worked effectively for them. But there was also a sense that people were perhaps avoiding some of the things that had maybe triggered highs in the past, and that was having an impact on their mood as well. So was, you know, almost they were not engaging in things to stop themselves going high, but that perhaps they not being able to engage in those pleasurable activities was actually, you know, making them feel a little bit low. So there was that difficulty, I think, and I think you find that as well throughout the lifespan with people that you work with, and that finding that balance. Is that something you think, Victoria?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think it hasn't gotten to that point where I'm avoiding activities so much. Maybe because I've created the activities that I enjoy don't trigger myself. But definitely I resonate with knowing the coping skills that work for me, knowing my warning signs much more quickly, having a lot better insight. I'm also past the sort of negotiating whether I have a mental illness or not, and that was sort of one of the issues when I was first diagnosed. And then knowing what my protective factors are, so the things that I need to do to stay well. So yeah. So that people had learned some of those techniques over time, and were finding them really useful. And a lot of them were using distraction on a more day-to-day basis to help keep the mind occupied. But I think having more time alone, and with that, with potentially changes in role and changes in not perhaps having as busy a lives as they had when they were younger, allowed that time to reflect on previous mistakes and previous difficulties and previous and that kind of brought up these sort of feelings of guilt and shame, that people had more time really then to reflect on those experiences, which would pull their mood down as well. I certainly relate to the change in role, particularly in COVID. My business was based on conferences, so of course it just sort of flattened any work that I had. And so I can imagine, I did experience it where, because I think a lot of us, at least myself, get a lot of satisfaction out of our work, And so when I wasn't working, there was a whole change and shift in identity and self-esteem and confidence, which influence my mood, and because I have a vulnerability to it. So it definitely influenced and triggered a depressive episode. And so being able to find things that are valuable, and so I'm thinking of volunteering and feeling like I'm connected to my community again and things like that. So I think those are important strategies.
Definitely, and that was one of the things. It's about sort of finding more ways to manage those losses and those transitions, and find different ways to fulfill those internal needs, really. And finally, it was having a strong network of friends and family that was really important to people. So just a few points really on what this. So when I did the food focus groups, the people had very clear ideas about what they wanted from therapy, and what they wanted from a therapeutic relationship. So there was this really clear sense that they had survived living with bipolar. And if you read the literature, they do term people over the age of 60 sometimes as a survivor cohort. So there was this real strong sense that people wanted to be treated with dignity and respect, which of course always, but additionally they wanted to be acknowledged for the wealth of experience that they would be bringing to the therapy and the therapeutic relationship. So, and also that wealth of experience that they could share with other people. So they wanted to have that acknowledged in therapy, but also be able to use that as skills to be able to share with other people, which I thought was really really interesting. And they felt they wanted real transparency with the therapist. They wanted it acknowledged that there was this difference in age, gender, ethnicity, the therapist's lack of having a diagnosis, and they really wanted time with the therapist to build up the relationship. So they wanted time before the therapy, they wanted to do the therapy, and then they wanted to sort of wind down after. So a lot of it was about building this therapeutic relationship that needed to be really trusting before they felt they could go into therapy and talk and open up with the therapist. And some of the issues that they were really keen to work on was things like assertiveness, confidence building, improving competence, all with a very encouraging stance throughout. And then when they were thinking about specifically what would need to be adapted for an older adult group, they did feel, so I went with a very open book and said, well, I don't want to make assumptions that this therapy that we're taking that's been developed for a younger group needs to be adapted for people in older age. I know what we know from the literature with other conditions, but we really don't know that much at this stage. But people were saying that yes, we do need to make some changes based on the experiences that they've had over their lifespan. So things with regards to memory difficulties, with so using strategies such as repetition, association, writing summaries at the end of therapy, and then revisiting at the beginning of therapy, using quite clear and simple language at times. And also using images, films, video, audio recordings of ways of enhancing the therapeutic experience and making study materials more accessible and visually interesting. So they did have some specific ideas about what they thought the therapy should look like. So the next stage was then to develop the recovery focused therapy for older people. So we took the existing manual that we had for younger people, and then we took what we know about older people in general, and then we took all the ideas and thoughts that had come through from the focus group, and then developed a recovery focused therapy for older people with bipolar. So now we've run that study. It's a small pilot feasibility study, and half the people have received therapy, half the people have carried on their treatment as usual, and that's just about to finish now. So people have been offered 14 sessions of recovery focused therapy, Like I say, it's been adapted to meet the needs of older adults, but it's a very flexible therapy. So it might, like I said before, it might not necessarily mean that therapy has to be adapted. It depends what the person's coming with. And there's lots more information about the specific therapy. I've added some details at the end where you can go to the links. And just really to think about, finally, what sort of things are covered in the actual therapy session. So recovery focused therapy is, it's a broad therapy in the sense that traditional CBT for bipolar has been about working on eradicating symptoms and preventing relapses, whereas recovery focused therapy is more about acknowledging that people do have, will have episodes and will have ups and downs and will have times where their mood fluctuates. But there are always other aspects of other people's lives that are meaningful and that can become part of that recovery journey. So we work on issues such as relationships, or such as jobs, such as social, developing friendships. So any aspect of somebody's life that they feel that they want to work on. But also we can work on symptoms and some of the traditional sort of CBT techniques that you'll do. And some of the things that came through in the therapy were some of the things that have come that we know about older adults in general. So we worked on relationships, we worked on loss of jobs, job roles, and finding more meaningful ways of filling those those needs, finding meaningful activities, rebuilding friendships, relationships, and sort of communication styles. And then also we did work on symptom management as well, when people felt that was their priority. So lots of different things that we covered. Have you got any final thoughts on that, Victoria?
No, except that the things that the people that you worked with shared what they wanted in the therapeutic relationship and the therapy, very identical to myself, about quality of life and acknowledging that it's a partnership with a therapist, almost identical.
Thank you so much, both Victoria and Lizzie, for that. It was, I think, really exciting to hear about this therapy that's clearly going to meet a really important gap in the treatments that people are being offered as they get older. And I think one of the really fascinating parts here is that it was also designed with that heavy consultation with people and respecting the expertise that people develop as they get older and accumulate experience managing the challenges and drawing up the strengths when you live with bipolar disorder. So that was a really interesting part for me to hear in your talk. What we're going to do now is turn to some of the questions that have been submitted beforehand, and I'll field them over to Lizzie and Victoria. So we'll get through as many as we can. We have had quite a few come in. If we don't get to yours in advance, I apologise, but we'll try to get through as many as we can over the next 20 or so minutes. So the first question that we have is about a specific kind of transition that occurs with aging for women. So our question asks, would you have any insights into the effect of menopause on bipolar disorder and whether hormone replacement therapy can be beneficial for mood swings? The doctors I've seen are dismissive and attribute increased mood instability to bipolar disorder.
Do you want me to, shall I have a, yeah. So I think we know so the menopause and the perimenopause, which actually starts to happen about 5 to 10 years, or can happen about 5 to 10 years before the menopause, it can lead to a drop in estrogen. And with a drop in estrogen, that can impact on people's mood and can impact on low mood. And there have been some studies that do indicate that when women are going through the menopause who have bipolar, that they are having more depressive episodes or times where they feel low. So there does appear to be a relationship between mood and the menopause. Do you have some more insight on the HRT, Victoria?
Yeah, it's interesting because that's one of the things that I feel like, and it'd be interesting that when women are more in their 60s, where their bodies may have acclimatized to sort of the hormone changes and all that. Because for me, as soon as menopause started, my depression and anxiety really increased, and so I spoke to my psychiatrist about it, and I understand that sort of dismissiveness. He was not dismissive. We both agreed that there's sort of evidence that sort of is contradictory in terms of hormone replacement, because I was really struggling. And so he was going to talk to a colleague of his. But in my head, I was idealizing hormone replacement therapy, where it's like, oh yeah, we just find one and that'll be it, and that'll just balance it. But I realize it's quite a delicate and intricate kind of trial and error. So he did acknowledge that there is an influence. If hormones are changing, it's got to impact mood. We went the way of looking at my current medication, and that's one thing that I found, is that my medication that was working previous to menopause was not working in the same way. So we were tweaking it and looking at it, and we sort of have things in our back pocket, and hormone replacement therapy might be it, but I don't have any experience personally with actually using it.
Thank you for the answers to that one. I think we had a chat about that outside of this webinar and agreed that the role of hormones on mood changes in bipolar disorder is a really interesting one that we'd love to dive into more deeply in future. The next question is, I've been living with bipolar disorder since the age of 25. I'm now 68 and don't have as many episodes, maybe one a year. My episodes, for the most part, have been manic. So does that mean I won't have any more episodes at all, or will I start having depressive episodes? So I think that relates to something that you said, Lizzie, about how people's experience of the different polarities changes as they get older.
Yeah, and I think the answer is that we don't. Everybody seems to have a different experience. So when I was talking about the research where people were saying that they have more lows generally, there were also a few other people that were saying actually that they might have more manias. So the trend seems to be that people have more lows, but I think that obviously everybody's experience of having bipolar is different, and that your experience might be that you're having this 1 year manic episode, and that might continue. I guess it might be about looking at, is there any certain triggers? Is there anything that happens around, is that at a certain time of year? So for example, I know for Christmas holidays that they can be triggers for mood changes, and perhaps being able to talk to somebody about that, and looking psychologically whether there's anything around that time that might be triggering your mood then.
I would probably just add that with that idea, for me, sometimes I almost do a sort of a scan of my wellness tools regarding depression. So let's say if you're not concerned about depression, but let's say you haven't had as much depression, looking at what you think may be influencing that and being a protective factor, and really recognizing how important that is, and so making sure that it continues to be a part of your life. Because I think that's, for me, it's been regulating my sleep, and so that I realize that that's sort of my priority around. And you probably are already doing all that. Sometimes it's just like taking stock of what's working, and maybe if there's been any changes. and just noticing patterns.
Okay, thank you. We've had a couple of questions come in on the topic of medication use as you get older, and particularly there are some concerns about what happens when you've been taking medications, mood stabilizers or antipsychotics for a long period of time. And I want to note that none of us in this particular group of presenters are psychiatrists, so what we can kind of specifically say to that is limited. But I was curious, Lizzie, whether that concern came up in your focus group about what happens when you've been taking medication for a long period of time, and what coping strategies people might have used to either have that conversation with their healthcare providers or to cope with that concern.
Yeah, so this came up in the focus groups, and a few, I think 2 or 3 people had actually talked to their psychiatrists and had their medication reduced. So obviously that's always a conversation that you need to have with the doctor or the psychiatrist. But one of the things we do know is that as you get older, you can become more susceptible to the effects of medication, and that can be in relation and the effects of the medication and the side effects. It's always important to have a conversation with your doctor if you feel like things have changed and you are perhaps having more difficulty concentrating or struggling more with your memory or feeling more drowsy in the day or struggling to get up in the morning, that you can have that conversation with your doctor, because like I say, the tolerance as you get older can reduce, and sometimes people do change their dosages of their medications.
Yeah, and I can speak to that with my mom, as I guess probably when she was maybe 84, because she wasn't showing any signs of depression or bipolar disorder, they were able to reduce her medication, and she at one point was on lithium and then valproic acid. And she's not on either of those. This was definitely, she's in a care home, so it was done under a lot of supervision. And she's on some other medication for anxiety. So her symptoms have reduced to a point that she doesn't need the medication. For myself, I've had to change it. I think reducing has always been of interest to me, but it had never worked. So I've been motivated because I was getting more breakthrough symptoms. And so we've chosen to sort of add things and then reduce some things.
I think one of the things that people can worry about sometimes in later life is having that conversation as well with a doctor or a psychiatrist. But I think it's just encouraging people really that if they do have concerns about the medication, that they should really feel comfortable to be able to talk to the psychiatrist and share their concerns with them, because I think people do worry sometimes about having that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And if, let's say, you have maybe not a really great relationship, or the psychiatrist isn't sort of in a partnership position, sometimes I found it's helpful to bring an advocate in with me so that I can articulate better. They can sometimes share what they're seeing or whatever. So at times it's my husband right now. When I was younger, it was my father, but my husband. So yeah.
Thank you. I think these are really good tips, particularly what you've just touched on, Victoria, about how sometimes these conversations aren't easy to have. So we obviously like people to be talking to their healthcare providers about these concerns, but sometimes it's challenging, and bringing an advocate or keeping records of changes in your experiences, any side effects, and kind of having that log of evidence to bring in can be really helpful and make people feel a little bit more confident having those discussions. Okay, we had a question which I think touches on another really prominent concern in that focus group that you ran, Lizzie, is about changes to memory and how you're thinking, and passing out what's bipolar related and what might be related to just growing older. So my mum was diagnosed with bipolar 2 roughly 15 years ago and has been treated with that medication since that time and is doing so much better. My question is, can bipolar disorder or the medications treating it cause memory problems? She has a hard time recalling events that happened when she was symptomatic prior to her diagnosis, but now will forget even little things an hour or two after they happened.
Yeah, so I think I touched on this earlier, that people with bipolar will will say that they have memory difficulties across the lifespan. So often when people are in episodes, so when someone's low, they have trouble recalling memories. They might be quite distracted and lack concentration, so they're unable to retrieve memories. When someone's high, they might not encode memories in the same way. They might encode and store them in their brain because they're so busy and active and on the go. So these are common things that people do present with throughout the lifespan. But obviously with aging, there is that additional that there are memory difficulties that come naturally as a product of aging. So I think it has been a great concern for some people that I've worked with, and often people they can't differentiate between is this a normal part of the normal aging process, or is this my bipolar that's causing my memory difficulties, or is it taking the medication that's impacting on that as well. And I think we know that most medications one of the side effects is that they can cause, like I was saying earlier, difficulties with concentration and difficulties with memory. So I think there's all these additional impacts that kind of work together when someone has later life bipolar disorder, because there's all these different areas that can impact on one another. There isn't the research out there to say whether one causes another. I put an article at the end of in the resource section, which has an area on the most up-to-date literature on cognition and older people with bipolar, and it talks about a few different studies that have been done, but unfortunately you just can't draw any firm sort of conclusions from those studies at the moment, because there aren't enough out there to say, does bipolar cause problems with memory or vice versa. But it's something that I guess the important thing is to say that it's a concern that a lot of people share, and actually it can sometimes be a reason why people stop taking their medication, because they're concerned about their memory difficulties. And obviously, again, that's always something that, we would recommend that you talk to your psychiatrist or your doctor about first as well.
Yeah, I would just chime in that, I think it's important to look at if it is a side effect, and, there's then the lesser of two evils is the memory and concentration issues. Are they, that might be a trade-off for being more mood stabilized. Generally, though, for myself, because I've experienced, I am noticing more recall issues. And so I've sort of, at this point, decided not to sort of worry about where or why that's occurring. I'm watching it if it's getting worse, but just using management or memory strategies. So I guess that's one of the suggestions I would have, is that as people are having memory issues, to still explore what the influences and causes might be, but also just generally for good brain health, do memory tools and memory strategies. So, I mean, I don't know a lot of them, but, you could do Sudoku, I do crossword puzzles, I do, regular puzzles, learning new things, all that kind of stuff, things that stimulate my brain, and then using association and things. So I think that's important regardless of whether you have bipolar disorder or not, and would influence your brain if you do have bipolar disorder. I don't know if that's accurate, Lizzie, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Those are some of the strategies that people use. It's like you say, it's to keep your brain stimulated, that cognitive stimulation, and some of those techniques that you're talking about are definitely ones that we'd use.
And we will share again, the Google Doc has just been dropped in the chat on the Zoom webinar, and we'll also be sharing this after the event. But we do have some links, and we also have our Bipolar Wellness Centre, which has a lot of tips about some of those cognitive strategies that people might use to cope with changes in their memory or support their thinking, which probably will be particularly relevant. Our last question, and we don't have a lot of time, so I might ask you to share your one biggest tip that you would have for this person, is how you would cope with some of these life transitions in terms of finding things to look forward to as you get older, changes in your social circle and your ability as friends pass away, or as you become more distant from family members, particularly with this double whammy of physical distancing due to COVID-19. What would a tip that you have be to people managing that life transition in this particularly challenging time?
I think the most important thing that I found through my experience of working with older people is to have a meaningful activity, because not only does that that's time spent doing something, but it gives you a sense of purpose and a reason, and also hopefully some interaction with somebody else. So it's about finding something that you enjoy, but also that will give you that sense of, that you're contributing, that you've got a purpose, and that you've got something really to do.
Yeah, I would just agree with that. I mean, I'm not in sort of that transition yet from moving out of work, but I know when I've been depressed, it's been really important to have a meaningful activity where I also can feel a sense of mastery. And so even if I'm feeling depressed, what it also gives me is a bit of distraction. And also typically, not always, it'll give me some social connection depending on what kind of activity it is. So for me, it's really cultivating several meaningful activities so that if I can't do one, there's another one, because being idle is what really makes it difficult. And from what you were saying, Lizzie, that sort of more time on your hands, if you're more susceptible to depression, is difficult. And it's good to have those occupational activities.
And I think this links back to the article I talked about right at the very start of this webinar, is that for some older people, they were actually coping much better than might be expected with physical distancing due to COVID-19, because perhaps having gone through that life transition already, people had gone through that work of identifying meaningful activities and things that you could do, even with physical health limitations or changes to your social circle. So that really speaks to that power of finding meaning in what you're doing, and whatever you can do to support that process will be really beneficial for your quality of life. This is always hard because we get so many more questions than we have time to answer, unfortunately, but I would like to thank the presenters for your expertise that you've shared today and your thoughts on this really important topic, and for getting around to some of those quite thought-provoking questions. I'd really love to see the literature of the next couple of years address some of those topics that there's clearly so much passion and interested in, but we just want to know more. So thank you once again to Lizzie and Victoria. I'm just going to wrap up by quickly running through some additional resources that you might find helpful. So this is a little preview of the document that has been dropped into the chat box. So this is where you can find some of the resources developed by the Spectrum Centre, including their e-booklet on recovery. You can also see this video online. This was developed again through consultation and focus groups with people who have lived with bipolar disorder, and their thoughts on how to find that sense of meaning and personal recovery. So like Lizzie said, not just thinking about symptoms, but how to live well. This is the article that I was talking about earlier about that good news story about how older adults are coping with the pandemic, which I think is really important to reflect on some of those good news stories about, and it might prompt people to think about some of their own strengths that they're bringing to this challenging time. We also have a blog that's recently gone up on our Crest.BD website from one of our peer researchers, Raymond, who's lived with bipolar disorder and has some really wonderful reflections about that process of finding meaning, finding activities that bring him joy and social connection. And I think it's a really lovely blog with some really moving personal insights. So it would be great if that link is also in the resource document, and I would highly recommend giving that a read. Some really exciting news. I mentioned briefly our Bipolar Wellness Centre. This has just undergone a full refresh. The team has put in a lot of hours into updating the content. Laura has updated the look and feel and made it much more streamlined and enjoyable to find things on. So this is a place where we house all our evidence-supported tips about how to live well with bipolar disorder across those different quality of life areas. So particularly if you had concerns or questions about memory and cognition, this is a really good place to visit to read more about the research and get some tips as well about how to practically cope with those changes. If you're interested, the quality of life tool is where you can kind of take the temperature of how you're doing across all of these different life areas. Many people find it useful to reflect on where they might be doing well and find some of those strengths and meanings, but also to direct them to areas that they might need a little bit more support. We have our Crest.BD academic website, which tells you about all of the research that we are doing at the moment, where you can sign up to our newsletter and keep up to date about any research opportunities that we have or new findings. Our Talk.BD events will be going on summer break over August, and we'll be back in September. So you can view all of our previous recordings at talkbd.live. But we'd also really love to hear from you about what kind of questions and topics you'd like us to cover in the future. So please do feel free to submit comments and questions either there or in this survey following the event. And once again, we'd like to thank all of those who fund our work and the partner organisations who have helped us out with this series of events. If you'd like to stay up to date with Crest.BD, here are all of our social media websites. And once again, we'd really love if you could complete the survey, give us some feedback about the event, and let us know where you'd like to see us take it in the future. So thank you so much to everyone who has attended, who submitted your questions, and to our hosts, Lizzie and Victoria, who shared their expertise today. Until the next time we all meet, stay healthy and well, and we wish you all the best. Bye.